If you are interested in lifting weights, in the beginning when you're first learning, you don't necessarily need to lift to muscle failure to the point where like you can't lift another rep. And in fact, it could be dangerous because as a beginner, you might not necessarily have the proprioception or the technique solid enough to be able to fail safely. And also, like, the studies show that it's not really necessary for you to go to muscle failure in order to build muscle and to get stronger. So for beginners, muscle failure is not really super necessary. But the more advanced you get, the closer you need to train towards muscle failure to get maximum muscle fiber recruitment, maximum motor unit recruitment, which is going to maximize your gains. Oh, my butt. The closer you get to muscle failure, the more that you fatigue your muscles, the more your muscles are going to engage. You're going to get more engagement in the muscles the closer you get to muscle failure. So even if you don't necessarily go until you can't go anymore, it's a good idea to get close to muscle failure if you can, and just like leave 1 or 2 reps in the tank. But there's plenty of programs out there that will suggest like full, as many reps as possible, go to failure, go until like you can't lift anymore. Failure in general can be defined in a bunch of different ways. So that's another thing you need to keep in mind when you start a program. If it does suggest going to failure, you got to ask like, what does it mean by failure? Does failure mean failure to like get past a certain point of the range of motion, like a sticking point? Like if you're able to do like a partial rep, but then you got a sticking point and you can't get past that, is that failure? Failure could also just be like failure to be able to do a full range of motion. And then some people actually define failure as like when the weight starts to slow down, or they might define it as when your form starts to fail. But generally, we want to only practice good reps, and we want to stop before form starts to break down or right as it starts to break down and stop your set there. You do form failure. Yeah, I feel like form failure is a little bit safer than full muscular failure, because if you continue with bad form, like to cheat the weight up, you risk getting injured from just having your body out of alignment. Trying to carry on after form failure is a great way to hurt yourself. Exactly. When I was doing more powerlifting type of program, we had sets of AMRAPs. Yeah, and that's like, it's AMRAPs are great because like they kind of teach you where your max actually is. I find that a lot of my clients tend to undershoot and underestimate how strong they are and how many reps they actually can do. So doing AMRAPs can be really helpful. AMRAP meaning as many reps as possible, sets where you do as many reps as possible until like you just can't lift anymore. But even then, like not going to complete failure, especially when you're powerlifting, doing like compound lifts, you want to be careful of that. You don't want to get into the habit of practicing failure. Exactly. You have to learn to read your body. Form failure for the compound lifts, like squats and deads, cheat reps on some isolation movements are not necessarily bad, but this does get into advanced versus beginner. Exactly. So it is a question, like whether you should train to muscle failure really is a question of beginner versus advanced. For beginners, I really don't recommend it because the risk of injury is just too damn high. And the risk of practicing bad form is too high. When you're a beginner, when you're in that first 6 months to a year, even 2 years of training sometimes, depends on how consistent you are. You want to try as much as possible to only practice good form and good reps. And so once you start to get your form starts to break down, end your set there. But once you get into more advanced styles of lifting, your body is going to adapt to whatever stimulus you give it. So if you've been lifting for a couple of years or at least a year or two, then your body it's going to get harder for you to build muscle than it was in the beginning because your body is just becoming efficient at the activity. It's trying not to spend too many calories, and your body's just going to get better at doing the activity. So in order to keep your muscles growing, this is part of progressive overload, you do have to stimulate them more as an advanced person. Whereas like you can leave 2 or 3 reps in the tank most of the time as a beginner and you're still gonna build a lot of muscle. Can you leave 2 or 3 reps in the tank as an advanced person and still build muscle? Yes, you absolutely can. But you may be sacrificing some gains. Going close to muscle failure, leaving 1 rep in the tank, or going to form failure, the more that you fatigue your muscles, the more you're going to get motor neuron recruitment. Because here's what happens. When you start your set where you're doing, say, bicep curls, at the beginning of the set, your full biceps muscle is not engaged. There's some fibers, some motor units that are engaged and some that are kind of taking a chill, and they're just like hanging back, waiting to jump in if the first guys start to get tired. And so the longer that you go, the more that you continue to force the muscle to contract against that resistance, those initial motor units are going to fatigue, and then other motor units are going to hop in to take over the work, right? And you can start to feel that as your muscles burn. The closer that you get to failure, the more of that like swapping out, and you have like motor units jumping in to take over the work. That's how that happens. And so if you end the set as an advanced person early, then there's some motor units that just aren't going to get activated during that set, if that makes sense. So it's like you have your A team, your B team, your C team, you know what I mean? And if you're not training towards failure as an advanced lifter, your C team muscle fibers might never get activated because they're never forced to, because they just stay in the wings like waiting. So that's where it can be very helpful to train to muscle failure or train close to muscle failure. But there are plenty of studies showing that, you know, training to muscle failure is really great for maximizing gains for advanced lifters, for experienced lifters. And then here's something very interesting. And this, I'm only going to speak to the male body because these studies were only done on male bodies. Typically, you know, according to the American College of Sports Medicine, usually for these kinds of muscle building, hypertrophy type of sets of resistance training exercises, usually you're going to work with a load of between 60 and 75% of your 1 rep max. And then, you know, do sets of between 6 and 12 reps. That's like pretty standard. That's the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations. And that's what their recommendations have been for many, many years. But there was a study showing that, it was a 2016 study, that showed that individuals experienced in resistance training, they can achieve like the same level of hypertrophy with higher repetition sets of 20 to 25 reps with a lower load of 30 to 50% of their 1 rep max. But isn't that so interesting? The study basically is showing the number of reps you do, the load that you do is less important than going to muscle failure. It's going to muscle failure or approaching muscle failure that is important for building muscle. So if you want to build muscle and you have a limited amount of weight that you can use, or if you're doing calisthenics, then you need to be lifting towards failure or doing your exercises towards failure, if not at failure. I find this study exciting because, you know, I have clients who are in calorie deficits working on fat loss. And I recommend doing muscle building style training when you're in a fat loss phase to help combat the breakdown of muscle tissue when you are in a calorie deficit. But when you're in a calorie deficit, sometimes lifting even 60 to 75% of your 1 rep max for sets of like 6 to 12 is just too fucking much, dude. Like it can sometimes even be scary getting under the bar. Even at 75%, when you're in a calorie deficit and your body's maybe not recovering the way that it normally does. So if like you're feeling like I am a little bit nervous about lifting even a 75% load of my 1 rep max right now because I just feel kind of fucked up from my calorie deficit. According to this study, you really could reduce the weight even as far down as 30% of your 1 rep max and just do a higher number of reps. And as long as you're going to muscle failure, you could potentially be still building muscle or combating the loss of muscle. I'm excited by this, and I'm going to definitely be using this principle in my programs moving forward, specifically for my people who are on a fat loss journey and trying to combat the breakdown of muscle, or maybe even try to build muscle while they're in a calorie deficit. Especially, I'm interested in those higher number of rep sets with the lighter loads. Because, you know, it's like we joke all the time, like a lot of power lifters will say, you know, their cardio is just like lifting lighter weights for higher number of reps. And, you know, if you're on a fat loss journey and your number one goal is to be in a calorie deficit, you can burn more calories with a set of 15 or 20 on your squats. And if you're going to muscle failure, you may still be building muscle while also burning more calories, or at least stimulating muscle growth, depending on a lot of factors. But I mean, I think it's interesting, and I don't know what you guys think, but that is something that I found this morning, and I find it exciting.